Welcome to chapter 7. We are starting this chapter with talking about class and money, which makes sense that these would be two themes in not only this book, but a lot of our other books, because at this point in time in history, we're beginning to see the rise of middle class, which was starting to stir fear in the nobility, for example, because you needed to differentiate yourself in some form. This is actually something I talked about, for example, in my Cruel Prince analysis of how Valerian and Locke, for example, like to hunt the humans because it was the only thing that the high folk could do, whereas the lesser folk aren't allowed to. We learn in like the Tive series, but not the sidetrack there. But like the point of this is that they needed something to differentiate themselves because it really wasn't. And one of the things that you notice, for example, in this opening chapter is this description. The first paragraph is that Mr. Bennet brings about 2,000 pounds a year. That's what they live off of. And that when he married Mrs. Bennet, who was the daughter of a attorney in Meryton, he left her 4,000 pounds. And if you look at her brother and sister who are still in trade or married to someone in trade, they seem to be doing better off with money wise. But yet, Mrs. Bennet gives herself more heirs because she has married a gentleman landowner. And it's fascinating. You see then like how they steadily need to marry into those in trade to get money. For example, this is very similar to the dollar princesses that we see emerging during the 1900s of American heiresses marrying into nobility because of their failings of their estate in the early 1900s, like I said. But also, it makes sense that this would be very subtly a theme in this book because this book, in my opinion, is a rags to riches story. It is her most fantastical, like I've said very early on, I believe in chapter 1, and like in a different video, that this is her most fantastical of a story of someone who is so lower marrying someone so high up compared to all her other books, but yet in a very Jane Austen tone, she kept it in a very realism lens. But I believe this is one of the reasons why Pride and Prejudice has stayed so popular is because it is slightly more fantastical than her other stories. The other thing that's interesting about this opening paragraph is when you look at Mrs. Bennet and the way that she gives herself airs, that they're actually not that high when you compare them to Mr. Darcy and even Mr. Bingley because they have more money, so they seem better, but they're technically of the same class. But are they of the same class? But the funny thing is that Mrs. Bennet is not too dissimilar from the Bingley sisters. They all three of them are giving themselves more air than they actually have. They think themselves higher than they actually are because of this very thinly veiled facade of being gentlemanly, even though they all three of them were born to a father of trade. And the brilliance of Jane Austen's books is her use of foiling characters who are actually very similar, but yet they act like they are different, or they might have slightly different circumstances or have same circumstances but react to it differently. That is what makes the story brilliant, is the way that she foils her characters, and you see how different people react to these things or act in the same manner. Like I said, Mrs. Bennet and the Bingleys are acting in a very similar manner, but they see to each other, they think that they're very different. I believe Jane Austen is taking a note from Frances Burney's book of very subtly proposing a topic of discussion that, if said outright, would cause uproar in certain communities. And I made a whole video talking about how Frances Burney is very subtly tongue-in-cheek poking at the folly of what society expects of young ladies. And in this case, I want to bring up that I think Jane Austen very subtly is pointing out that you should educate young ladies, that you have to remember, most likely at this point in time, to educate a young lady, it was upon the parent to have done it, or if they were rich enough to hire a governess. And as we learned from later of Catherine de Bourgh, Lizzie tells her that they did not have a governess, that their mother had handled their education, but that also led to their downfall, as we will see, like even here in chapter 7 with this description. Like, it's just trying to describe how close Longbourn is to Meryton, that is only like a mile, that often they would visit 3 or 4 times a week. But here we also have the two youngest of the family. Catherine and Lydia were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters, and when nothing better offered, a walk to Meryton was necessary to amuse their morning hours and furnish conversation for the evenings. And I say that she is very subtly pointing towards education because she says that these two are vacant minded. And you see a difference in personality and outlook on life and the way that they are members of society with the younger two compared to, for example, the older two. Now, the older two would have received a better education from their mother because it was still early days. She still would have cared. She would have been trying harder. By the time we get to the youngest, she would have been tired and over it and kind of left them to their own devices. Because of that, you see that Lizzie and Jane are better situated for society. They're more educated. You even see it with their conversation with their father that the father thinks that they are well rounded, well read. And because of this, it makes them more compassionate and form better opinions and things like that. Whereas Lydia and Kitty, because they're not reading and doing the things that their older sisters had done to round out their personalities and themselves, they focus on silly little things like outfits and gossip. That is gossip and having fun is the focal point of these two young girls, which fits with being young too, but also because no one was taking them in hand and rounding out their education and shaping their personality. They're kind of left to run wild, which in turn causes these downfalls for characters like Lydia. So I think Jane is very subtly pointing out that educating the importance of educating young ladies create more well-rounded and better members of society. But right now the society is to have young ladies like that is all on the parent to do that work when like already they're busy and have others, as we see with Mrs. Bennet. It fell to the side by time you got to the youngers, or if they can afford it. So I think maybe she's proposing the need of having education being as important as it is with young boys. Again, we have to remember Jane Austen's father ran a small school for boys that he would teach, or making it kind of the community schools, which weren't common then, mostly because kids were needed on farms. But I think Jane is trying to point out that, like, if you want better members of society, education is important for them. We get our first introduction to the regiment coming into Meryton and how much joy this brings Kitty and Lydia. And I don't begrudge them because we have to remember they're either like 15, 16, or like 16, 17. And I remember when I was their age, I was extremely boy crazy. And once again, I want to remind you that marriages for ladies like this, they're not traveling for seasons to London to other house parties often. They have to wait for men to come to them. They have to come to the community. And all of a sudden, you have a surplus of guys. You have all the pickings. And they may not be as wealthy as, say, Mr. Bingley, which literally there's a line that they could talk of nothing but officers. And Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals. And it's because, like, to them, like, money, it doesn't seem as important as obviously someone like Mrs. Bennet who has lived through more hardships than them. And we have to remember that also the men of the regiment are the closest you're going to get to knights. They're heroic and brave and also a man in uniform. So that's why I think they're very much obsessed with the regiments compared to, say, the Bingleys. But also, we have to remember that Mr. Bingley's eyes already caught Jane's. So he is already focused on her. So the competition, like instead of competing for one guy, you have a multitude that are open for flirting. And I think for them, they just want to flirt. I think they're not really thinking about marriage at this point in the book. So Kitty and Lydia obviously have been talking endlessly about the regiments, and Mr. Bennet makes the comment, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be two of the silliest girls in the country. I've suspected it sometime, but I am now convinced." And it's a funny line because there's so much truth to the situation when you compare it to others like Mary, Jane, and Lizzie, who have, like I said earlier, more of an education, more depth to their personality. There's a truth to it. The two, Kitty and Lydia, as mentioned earlier in this chapter, focus more on gossip and those kind of things because their mother was more lenient on their education, getting more tired by the end. But at the same time, like, we can't hate the two girls for this because it's so natural. That's exactly what girls are like at that age. They are silly unless their, personality skews or education skews them maybe to be a little less silly. But I think, like, Jane and Lizzie probably would have done something very similar, but their education from their father and mother was a little bit more demanding, I guess you can say, where they didn't present the same way as Kitty and Lydia, who have been presented with mostly just having a good time. And they had a little bit more leniency in their own pursuits. And like I said, though, their boy craziness is not abnormal, it is perfectly normal. And it's just funny that it's being called out because we call out girls like this today still. So, this is another reason why Pride and Prejudice is still so beloved today, is that despite the difference of the situation, the society, the outfits, at its core we act the exact same way as all these characters in this book, and especially at the same age. Following Mr. Bennet's comment about the two girls being silly, we get this response in like kind of conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, where Mrs. Bennet says, "I am astonished, my dear, that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. If I wish to think slightly of anybody's children, it should not be of my own, however. If my children are silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it." And this is kind of like the root of the problem. And I love the conversation that's kind of subtly being presented here of parenting styles, that this, what's going on here, leads to later conflicts and follies. This is the root of it, that Mrs. Bennet does not see her children as imperfect. Well, actually, she kind of does. She does call them out for it. And you see that she doesn't like, Mary acting a certain way, or Jane, like all those things. Like she's trying to steer them in like a very particular way, but yet doesn't curb them in a productive manner. And neither does Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet calls them out for a lot of their follies and faults, but does not steer them in a productive manner, which leads to them acting the way that they do later down the line, which leads to conflicts that, like, Mr. Darcy calls out on when he presents Lizzie with the first proposal, and Lizzie is very much aware herself, but no one's productively steering them to be better. They're just being called out for being silly or for their faults, if that makes sense. So I like the conversation being here of like parenting styles, of like a parent having a blind eye to your child's faults, but also a parent being very much aware of a child's faults, but not taking the action needed to push them and develop them into being better people. Mrs. Bennet then says, like, we can't critique our girls for being foolish. You can't say, like, they don't have the wisdom that their mother and father had because they haven't had the years yet, which starts off so good. Like, that's correct. But then she says, of course, they won't be thinking about officers as they get older, and then proceeds to talk about officers herself, which, like, disproves her theory because it shows that, like, she's exactly the same as she was then. She's thrown right back in, which I think is trying to point that you can have so many years of life and go through so many experiences, but unless one of those experiences pushes you to confront your faults and you choose to become a better person, like what will happen with Lizzie and Darcy, you will be kind of the same person. Jane Austen also does a very brilliant job of showing us characters' personality without telling us. She leaves enough for us to interpret with dialogue and situations. For example, this letter from Caroline Bingley to Jane inviting her says, "If you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives. For a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on the receipt of this. My brother and the gentleman are to dine with the officers. Yours always, Caroline Bingley." First off, you have, if you're not so compassionate. So it's putting it like, the way that it's presented is like, if you're a good, kind person, you would come to my rescue. It's kind of a little manipulative, the way that she presents it, and then says, "Me and Louisa will are in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives. A whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel," which is such a, like, very, it shows you the dynamics of the two sisters, that they cannot be alone together. While they are on the same team often and they do somewhat get along, they equally cannot. They equally butt heads a lot, which is very different than Jane and Lizzie, as we see. Even when they disagree, they never butt heads in such a vital way. So I love just that one line about the tete-a-tete tells us a lot about Caroline and Louisa's personalities, that it's comes even down to the family, that they are even hostile and competitive with one another. What Jane Austen does that's a little different than others of her time, and even today, like if you read any Regency or historical fiction or romances being published today, often they're being placed within the upper classes. They're going to London for a season. They all have plenty of horses to horse their carriage, to have personal ones for each of the kids. Meanwhile, the Bennets do not. That their horses that would, be used for their carriage are also being used for the farm that brings their annual income. Mr. Bennet literally says they are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them. And that is such a great way of showing the readers their wealth and their place in society, that they're kind of middle class while their father has inherited land and is not like, say, a tradesman. He's kind of closer to middle class than, say, someone who is showing in more books being published today where they're in the upper classes. They're titled, they're just scraping by kind of with their income. They have to share a horse. They don't have multiple horses. And that's what I think I like about Jane Austen, is that she's showing such a middle of the way of life. They're not dirt poor, but they're not super rich. And this is this is a wish fulfillment book, but it's not her going from nothing to a title like Cinderella. This is someone going from a lower end of the middle kind of spectrum to an upper end of the spectrum with Mr. Darcy, who has more wealth and more influence and land and, possessions. So Jane then sends Lizzie a letter the next morning saying that I am sick. Do not be worried if you hear news of the doctor being sent to me. And here's the thing about the time, and I was learning about this in my At Home with Jane Austen by Lucy Worsley. Reading letters was a communal thing that often, when you're writing letters, you were aware that they were probably going to be read aloud to an audience most often. So there's a lot of hidden messages often in letters, or the ways that they're presented, or sometimes you'd mark. That's why Kitty and Lydia had hidden messages and would read be cautious of the excerpts that she would read aloud when Lydia goes away. But the reason why she sends it to Lizzie, I think on one hand, is that she knows that she is going to read it aloud because that is very common of the day, but also that she would at least be blunt and gives the straight answer, whereas her mother probably wouldn't and would be in celebration and probably not even give the fullest detail that the others would be desirous of knowing, and or over exaggerate the details of the doctor coming, for example. So, and also she's the closest with Lizzie. It makes sense that she would send it to Lizzie too. But I just wanted to share that little tidbit about how letters were often read aloud amongst families. So you were probably not sharing hidden secrets unless you put a little note don't read this aloud, because often you would be read amongst the family or whoever was in the party. Think of also and Emma, Mrs. Bates, often reading Jane Fairfax's letters aloud. I feel like a big thing of this is also hypocrisy of viewing others differently than you view yourself. That for example, I pointed out that the Bingley sisters view others, look down on others, but act in a very similar way to Mrs. Bennet. They look down on Mrs. Bennet, but they all act very much the same. And I'm saying that with Mr. Bennet saying well, my dear, if your daughter should have the dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know it was all in the pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders. And she responds with, oh, I am not at all afraid of her dying. People do not die of little trifling colds. She will be taken good care of. And it's funny to me because she makes such a big deal of her nerves and gets in such a tizzy, and she puts herself to bed and is away and in the vapors when Lydia is run off with Mr. Wickham, and it's this whole big deal and whole production. Whereas when her daughter is actually sick, she's like, oh, it's fine, whatever. And it's just I love the hypocrisy of it, the slight selfishness of it, which people in life very much like this. This read through, I'm realizing a lot of Mary's dialogue feels like it's being repeated verbatim from etiquette books or Fordyce's sermon, those kind of books where she says, I admire the activity of your benevolence, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required. When Lizzie declares that she will walk to Jane to visit her, she says, the distance is nothing when one has motive, only 3 miles. I shall be back by dinner. And I love what Mary is saying because it's so a word jumble that you're it definitely came from a book, but also is saying that every action should be guided by reason, which fits within the Enlightenment period, which Jane Austen is straddling between the Enlightenment and the Romanticism era philosophy. If you wish to know more about that, I recommend you check out my YT, and I have a video on the history that Jane Austen wrote during, but also I talk about the Enlightenment and Romanticism in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes video I posted over there too. They influence a lot of the books I'm reading right now, but it's the exertion should always be in proportion to what is required. And what it's inferring here is that you're putting in more work than what is required for you to go visit Jane. Like, Jane is obviously fine. Like, she's not that sick, supposedly, or at least in their, like, Mary and maybe Mrs. Bennet's opinion. A doctor's already been called for. You already have both the Bingleys and Mr. Bingley, like sisters and Mr. Bingley, looking over her, and a household of servants. She should be fine. It's a little too much exertion for Lizzie to walk all that way to check on her sister. And it's saying that, like, it's almost out of etiquette to do so, is what I think Mary's inferring, which also you see it kind of reacted in a similar way by the Bingley sisters. They react very similarly, like, why did she walk all this way? I love towards the end of this chapter, Lizzie says that, she started to like the sisters herself when she saw how much affection and solicitude they showed for Jane. But the paragraph ends with, um, nor were the other ladies often absent. The gentlemen being out, they had in fact nothing to do elsewhere. And that's the thing, that they're only being so affectionate. It's all production, it's all a show for Jane, just because there's nothing else entertaining. Jane is their source of entertainment right now. They cannot be left alone, as they had said in their letter to Jane early in this chapter, that the moment that the gentlemen are here, as we will see in the next chapter, they aren't as present with Jane. It's just Jane is their entertainment right now, and to make them feel good as a production of being kind and caring. But the moment that something more entertaining comes along, or something that is a better pursuit, they ignore Jane a little bit more and become hostile also when they realize certain facts, that she is not a good alliance, for example, all those kind of things. So it is a very one-sided, what can they get out of Jane?